I think that we can start. And first, I'd like to say that today we will unfortunately only have Hadar because I did not plan well enough for the future. So I did not discuss with Milosh the time for this workshop, but the next workshop he will also be joining us. But I still think that with Hadar this will be as amazing as it was before. And with that, I now give the floor to Hadar to start the workshop.
Cool. So hi everyone. As already mentioned, today Milos will not accompany me, but he'll join us back in the next meeting. Today we'll be discussing burdens of proof for motions as opposed to for arguments, the way we've learned the last meeting. So just to specify real quickly the difference, and we'll delve deeper into that soon. When we are searching for burdens of proof for the notion, we are not searching for the sub-parts of arguments that need to be proven for arguments to stand, but rather, what are the key clashes the motion has that need to be won? And this will help us identify what arguments to choose in the first place in order to fulfill these burdens or these clashes. Before we go more into what they are, let's start with a little hypothetical thought experiment. So let's start by testing your refutational abilities. I argue Artyom is very destructive to my lesson. He keeps talking all the time. How would you rebut me? What would you say?
He has the microphone muted most of the time, so he can't do this.
In other words, if I were to think of burdens for what I was trying to prove here, the biggest burden is to show that indeed Artyom is disturbing me in the first place. Before I go into proving any specific policy that could solve it, I want to prove that there is a problem because it's not trivial. Let's go a step further. Let's say Artyom was really disruptive of my lesson. In fact, Artyom is famously known for being notoriously against every rule and every law and doing absolutely everything to destroy any lesson, and he doesn't care at all what lecturers think about it or want to teach. I propose asking him nicely to stop talking. What would you say in refutation to my proposed solution? Will I need to prove that there is a problem in this case, like I did before? Probably not. If we all know that Artyom is indeed destructive, I don't need to prove it. What do I need to prove? What would you say about my proposed solution?
That your instrument will work?
It doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't sound like a very effective solution to ask him nicely to stop talking. Let's take another step forward. Artyom is indeed this destructive person who always ruins lessons, so I take an AR-15 out of my pocket and shoot him in the head. He's dead. Question. Do I need to prove the existence of a problem?
No.
Do I need to prove that my solution solves the problem?
Still no.
Are we all in agreement that if I shoot Artyom, probably he will stop talking?
Probably.
What do I need to prove? What would you tell me?
Won't you create more problems than it were in the past?
Or I think even further than this, what could you say about my solution? What would be the biggest thing to challenge this solution?
That's too much for this kind of behavior.
Or in other words, it's not justified. It is not a proportionate way to solve the problem. Let's go a step forward than this. Let's say it is justified to shoot Artyom. Supposedly, Artyom is a terrible criminal that have done terrible crimes against humanity. However, I'm the only one who knows that. So, despite me doing a great good for humanity, I am going to prison for shooting Artyom. What would you say about my solution? Let's go starting from the beginning. Do I need to prove that there is a problem in the first place? Do I need to prove that I solved the problem? Why? Can anyone tell me that why I don't need to prove that I solved the problem? I went to jail. It doesn't sound like I solved it. Anyone who thinks I solved the problem can tell me why?
You solve the problem, but you can take to you another problem.
In other words, the solution of the problem is not the same as the utility. I have to solve the problem. Artyom does not disrupt my lesson any longer. But I have created myself a slightly bigger harm. So in this case, I won't need to prove the existence of a problem. I won't need to prove that I solve it, nor that it is justified, because let's say that we all agree that Artyom deserves to die. I will, however, need to prove that the benefits are worth the harms, that this was a utile solution. Let's go one step further. Artyom has disturbed my lesson, so my resolution is to order a piano, put the piano on a flight, and ask the airplane flyer to drop the piano on Artyom's head. What would you say about my solution? Let's say that I will never get caught for it.
That's too expensive. For Artyom.
Why? Well, be more specific. What's the problem here? What sounds odd about this oddly specific solution?
Not very efficient, is it?
As opposed to?
I don't know, taking AR-15 out of your pocket and shooting. Yeah.
In other words, there are probably alternatives which are slightly less oddly specific than this one. So, by the way, what I like usually about this part of this hypothetical is everyone asks why specifically a piano from an airplane rather than an AR-15, rather than asking why specifically killing him as opposed to other alternatives. So I'm glad that we're all on board, at least that this is what we are aiming for. But putting that aside, what we did here is a small demonstration of the basic burdens of proof for most policy motions, which will be the burdens of proving the existence of a problem, the motion to solve the problem, the motion to be justified, the motion to be utile, and the motion to be the best alternative we have as compared to other alternatives. Let's go one by one and start dissecting these burdens a bit more. So now I will start share screening and hope my computer won't blast. Okay. So in policy motions, not to confuse with other motion types, we'll discuss those soon. As said, there are five main problems. Burdens. The first burden would be to prove the existence of a problem. Note, this burden requires us both to prove that a problem exists and that it is problematic. Let's do a quick example of this, and I will ask you to participate. As a note, when I share screen, I cannot see your faces. It's mutually exclusive, so I will just ask you to be assertive and unmute yourself to answer questions. In the motion, this house would reserve parliament seats for women. Anyone has any idea what could be the problem to identify that the motion is aiming to solve?
There are not enough women in parliament.
Not enough women in parliament. Question. Do we insofar as we want to prove the problem here, do we need to prove that it is true that there are not enough women in parliament? Is it likely that anyone would argue that no, there is equal representation of women?
I mean, some people can say that there are some women in parliament, but equal, no. Yeah.
So probably the existence of a problem here is not the core question. Factually speaking, everyone will agree that there are more men than women in parliament because that's just life. However, will everyone agree that this is necessarily problematic? What could opposition say?
That probably if this statistical fact occur, it means that women don't want to be in the parliament, and there is no problem if men are well enough to rule the country.
Yeah, opposition will say, so what? Women have an equal right to vote. They vote in similar percentages. They vote for men that represent them. Why should they care what a politician has between their legs? We shouldn't choose politicians based on gender, but based on their policies. It's the most classic opposition argument here. So, in other words, in order to prove a problem, it's not enough to prove that it exists factually speaking, but we also need to prove the problematic nature of it. So in this example, I would probably want to show why a representation of women in parliament is important. So maybe men don't know women's issues well enough or don't care about women's issues well enough and therefore can't represent them, and so on and so forth. So first burden, to prove a problem, both its existence and its importance. Second burden, to prove that the motion solves the problem. If it doesn't, then it's kind of redundant. A few notes on that. Firstly, and it's important, your burden isn't to solve all the problems in the world. If you prove that women being misrepresented in parliament is a problem, and if you prove that the motion solves the problem by giving equal representation for women, an opposition tells to you in rebuttal, but there are other groups which are misrepresented in parliament. We also don't have a lot of ethnic minorities in parliament and religious minorities in parliament. What would you tell them?
Well, most easily that we would also vote for that motion, but are now discussing this one.
Yeah, possibly we also need to give them reserved seats. Maybe, maybe not. Sounds like a different motion. Not in anything our burden in this debate. On both sides of the debate, if the motion doesn't actively harm minorities, we don't need to care about a phenomenon we often call in discourse whataboutism. But what about the Black people? But what about the religious minorities? Yes, there are other problems in the world. It's not government's burden to prove a perfect world. All government needs to do is to prove that they solved the specific problem they identified, or at least improved it significantly. Secondly, use your model fiat. OG is allowed to define a model for the debate. It is usually going to be extremely important for proving that the motion indeed solves the problem. Thirdly, black market arguments, which we discussed in our earlier meetings, will always fall under this clash. So in the classic debate of like, this house would, let's say this house would ban cigarettes, since opposition is going to argue probably that there's going to be a black market for cigarettes, you have a burden to show that the motion solves the problem of smoking. It's not enough to say that we ban it, so obviously we can assume it's effective. You need to prove and we are able to enforce it. It won't be the same as what happened during the times that we banned alcohol and there was just a black market, which was much worse. As an example for practice, in the motion, this house would require parenting license from one to be parents. Who wants to tell me what you think is the problem that we are aiming to solve and why or what we need to prove that the motion solves the problem?
Well, I assume that the problem is that people are shitty at parenting.
Yeah, probably. What do we need to prove to show that the motion will solve it? What will opposition contest, probably?
Maybe
That
opposition.
this
will
parenting
tell-
license would help to
Why wouldn't it help? What could they say?
because they just go to those lessons and they took their license, but they don't use their knowledge which they took there because blah blah blah.
In other words, they will say the test for getting the license is not going to be effective. Whether it's going to be because people lie on the test and then act differently in real life, whether it is because the test can't test for good parenting because there are many different ways to be a good parent and you cannot know that from a simple questionnaire. Many different ways to do that. But now we understand that our biggest burden in this debate is to start by proving why the license will be effective, why we are able to identify who will and won't be a good parent in advance. And a lot of this will be through the model. We want to be able to define what we are going to do in this testing. Do we want to use the help of a therapist assessment during the license giving? Do we want to make open questions that are tricky so people will need to actively think of different situations? Do we want to maybe have an assessment of their past experience working with kids, and so in order to get some sort of an idea of how they are as educators? Anything that we want to define here can help us in analyzing why the motion is effective. Third burden of policy motions: justification. Any motion induces some form of harm or violates some right. How do I know this? Because motions are supposed to be balanced. That means that CAs set the motion thinking that it's not just obviously good, but probably there is an argument to be said on up. Given this being the case, we also need to prove why the motion is justified. It's not enough for it to solve a problem if we create a harm that the problem does not justify. Note, utility or utilitarianism can be a justification. We can say we create more benefits than the harm that we create, but it won't always be good enough as a justification. The most classic intuition pump that debaters like to give about this is, utility-wise, probably killing Artyom and donating his organs to 5 people would save more lives than it would take. But we would probably say that despite it being utile, it is still not justified. So often we will want to do more than just showing that it does a lot of good in the world, but also prove that we have a moral right to do that. As a practice, this house would implement a 100% inheritance tax. Who wants to tell me what they think will be the justification burden here? That is, what opposition is going to challenge or argue is unjustified, and maybe an idea on what we can prove to try and justify it. Let's start with the first. What will opposition claim is unjustified?
Why opposition thinks the government claim is unjustified?
Yeah. What is going to be our justification burden? What is opposition going to tell us that is unjust in this motion?
I mean, quite a lot of things. They're going to say that first of all, people have earned their money and then they have a right to it. Then when faced with, oh, there was infrastructure, education, social services, blah, blah, they're going to say that 100% is too much and you need to be able to leave something to your children.
In other words, all of these challenges are going to be on the grounds of property rights. Opposition is going to say people have a right to their property, and they can give many different reasons for why it's the case, whether it is because they earned it, whether it is because they are giving more than they received, whether it is because they already paid like income tax throughout their lives, so this is double taxation. All of these come back to the idea of property rights that we shouldn't infringe upon. And then we understand that our biggest burden in this debate as Gov is to prove that it is justified to harm the property rights of the people we are taxing. Anyone has an idea on what we can try and prove to show that it is justified? Not yet the analysis, but just bottom lines of arguments that we can go at.
I don't know, solving the wealth gap or solving all the society's problems with the money that we earn.
So, to be fair, this is an attempt to show justification on the grounds of utility, and while it can be done, it is a big burden to take, because according to this logic, we can also make a 100% income tax on the rich. In fact, this would be a justification for communism, and this is not, at the point at which you need to justify communism, usually you took too much of a big burden.
Probably we can say that people who have this money in their life, like when they are alive, they have them as the property, but their children do nothing to earn them, and they won't have the ability to be the hosts of this money.
Precisely. So one good argument we can try it is to prove that the property rights only belong to the person who directly earned the money, not to someone who was fortunate enough to win the lottery of birth and be born as the son of Jeff Bezos. They didn't do anything to earn it. We can prove similarly that the dead don't have property rights. Your rights only exist so long as you live. When you die, you lose all of your rights. We can go in the direction of showing that people have earned this money unfairly, perhaps, and therefore the state is justified in redistribution. There are many different directions to take here. The point is to identify that a big burden in this debate is to show why we are allowed to do such a thing. The next burden would be utility, and that would be to show that the motion does more harm than good, more good than harm, sorry, more harm than good is what opposition wants to say. To be clear, utility is a separate burden from the problem and solution one. Many people confuse this, so to give an intuition, I'll flag back to the example I gave at the beginning of this workshop. Me shooting Artyom and going to jail for this is non-utile. I have lost more than what I've earned. I've earned Artyom's silence, but I have lost my freedom. However, it doesn't change the fact that I did solve the problem. Artyom is no longer interrupting the lesson. So these are completely independent. A motion can be effective in solving the problem and still do more harm than good, and vice versa. It can not solve the problem and still do more good than harm. So these are separate burdens. Government's biggest benefit, that is the biggest good you can claim in the utility clash, should be the solution to the problem. If it isn't, if you spotted or identified a benefit that was larger than the benefit of solving the problem in the first place, it means that the problem was misidentified. I'll slow down and explain this for a sec. Motions usually have more than one benefit. They help in several ways. But usually, we want the identification of the burden to be correlating to what is the biggest benefit from the motion. To give an example, in the motion, this house would legalize all drugs. I can argue that one of the benefits of it is it will increase tax revenue from the state because we can tax the trade of drugs. It is definitely a benefit. But if my other benefit would be something like people have a fundamental right to choose what to do with their bodies, or alternatively, that we are solving a world of a lot of criminal activity in the black market, which sounds a tad bit bigger than the impact of more tax revenue, probably I don't want to frame the problem in this motion as the government doesn't get enough taxes. Usually, if the benefit we get from solving the problem isn't the biggest benefit in the debate, we misidentify the problem. And one last note on this. This particular burden, the burden of utility, requires being particularly comparative. It's always good to be comparative in debates, but it is especially important here. The point isn't just to prove a benefit, but to prove that the benefits outweigh the harms. So let's do an example together. In the motion, this house would not criminally investigate a ruling prime minister. Who can tell me what you think are the benefits prop will argue and the harms op will argue, and how could we possibly weigh between them?
Well, the prop would say that makes it impossible for a politically motivated prosecution of the prime minister, I suppose.
And the benefit of it would be?
The independent policy making and independent work as a prime minister.
Yeah, also probably they will say something about the ability of the prime minister to implement many policies. So presumably they are being significantly distracted and less effective in their work if they need to go under investigation. What will Op say as the harms of this motion?
Oh, corruption, nepotism, I don't know, contract killing, depending on the country you're in.
Yeah, so let's say we are prop here. Who can give me an idea of a weighing we want to aim to prove that shows that the benefits outweigh the harms?
First, can you explain, please, whether in this motion, is it possible in this motion to criminal investigate a prime minister after his
Yeah.
well,
Definitely.
then maybe the prop could waive and break opposition's case, saying that if there is a crime which really had a place and the prime minister really committed this crime, and then he can be criminally investigated after his term.
Precisely. So one good way prop can use is say most of the harms opposition describe can be prevented also retroactively. We can investigate after they finish ruling, whereas most of the benefits we achieve can uniquely be achieved only during the ruling period of the prime minister. After they are out of office, we can no longer get the benefits of them being less distracted, less prone to try and change their policies based on investigation, and probably most of the harms that prop is trying to solve, the problem of the prime minister trying to go around the investigation, being less effective in their job, etc., are all limited in time. Another possible weighing, by the way, could be a weighing of impact. So something I often like saying in this debate, look, corruption of a prime minister is usually rather small in scale relative to a government budget, because come on, at worst, an individual wants to earn a few dozens of millions of dollars, which is, let's say, the biggest that they will be able to extract out of a budget of a few $billions. It really doesn't matter that much. Whereas the less effective prime minister, or the prime minister that will make worse policies because of being under criminal investigation, can cost the government billions of dollars, which is quite bigger in scale, as another idea. And the less burden for policy motions will be the one of alternatives. I will say it is not always a burden. It is the least common one of them. We'll talk about this soon. We need to prioritize between burdens. But often, there is more than just one solution to a given problem. And we need to show not only that the motion solves the problem, but that it is the best way to solve the problem as opposed to other ways to solve it. Few notes on that. Firstly, usually we can avoid this burden if our analysis is specific enough. That is, if, say, I want to prove that the way to solve the problem of smoking is by banning it, rather than making a separate argument for each alternative, here's why added taxes on smoking won't help. And here's why putting ads on smoking that show that smoking is bad for you won't help, etc., which wastes a lot of time. So rather than making an argument to rebut any alternative, I would try to make my analysis of the solution sufficiently specific to the motion. I won't just show there is a problem of people smoking and we need to give them an incentive to stop smoking, because then opposition can give me many alternatives. I want to just analyze firstly why banning particularly is effective. That is, the problem is in the first place when it is accessible to you, when it is in the market, no matter how expensive it is at a given moment, and you need it and your addiction calls for it, you won't look at ads, you won't look at money, you will buy it as soon as it's out there. So I will always try to just analyze the solution from the get-go to be specific enough. The second thing to note here is we want to pay attention to wordings of the motion. So again, not in all motions this burden will be very relevant. In some of them, it's unlikely that the opposition will go and say, here's a list of alternatives. In some of them, it's more likely than others. And the way to identify this often is if the motion has words which are very specific terms. So like a specified group, a specified stakeholder, a specified place in which the motion happens, etc. As an example, in the motion, this House would lower the voting age to 16. What do you think is the word we need to notice? What is the burden of specificity here? What could be the alternatives?
Why exactly 16 years?
Why 16? And I will say from experience, this is the hardest motion, the hardest burden in this motion by far. The place where most governments fall here is by showing generic analysis to why 18 is too high, why we need to give children or young adults the right to express their minds. And then opposition will say, well, according to this logic, why not 14? Why not 12? Why not 0? Where do you draw the line? And then we identify that the biggest burden here is to show why specifically 16, which is quite hard to do. But we can discuss this later. I think as a brief note, the easiest way I usually like to do this is talking about 16-year-olds as correlated with high school students, and then talking about the stage of their life that they represent. They are already representing students. We don't need to also give representation to 14-year-olds because 16-year-olds know their incentives, but they are more mature in order to make these decisions for them.
Can I ask a question here?
Sure.
So basically, the alternatives in terms of the burdens of the motion, they are connected to, well, at least in Russian debating circuit, there is this idea that one way to weigh arguments is by how unique they are. And so basically whether alternatives exist. And like I have heard mixed views on this. So can you maybe clarify this more?
Okay, so it's a bit complicated. The point is this. Any sort of extension or ability to weigh arguments, I'm assuming you're talking mostly on extensions and weighing between top half and bottom half, will need to be based on relevancy to the specific debate at hand. So sometimes proving a specific burden that wasn't proven by the top half is very important, but it is mostly a question of whether or not this burden was challenged, was on clash. To give an example, in the motion this House would ban cigarettes, if OG analyzed why the government is justified in taking away people's rights, why the motion will be effective in preventing smoking, and so on and so forth, but they never analyzed why cigarettes are unhealthy, and CG comes up and says, we are the only one to prove cigarettes are unhealthy, it is probably not going to be winning despite the fact that they were the only ones to do this, because it's probably off clash. Opposition is likely to agree. Similarly, on the question of specificity, it is mostly a question of whether or not opposition contested it. So in this motion of lowering the voting age to 16, I would say it is extremely likely that making a specific extension and weighing it based on being specific to 16 is going to be worthwhile and a good weighing, because it is very likely that opposition will challenge this being where we should draw the line. However, in other motions, say this House would legalize marijuana, it is just not likely that opposition will offer a list of alternatives. No, we should, I'm not even sure what's the alternative that they would give to legalizing marijuana that would solve the government problem. So it really depends on whether or not specificity was even challenged in the debate. Does that answer the question?
Partly. My question was more in terms of, like, the government often has to argue for a specific solution. And then the opposition comes out and says, no, we have an alternative, we can solve this problem in a different way. And quite often those other solutions are kind of okay, or they may be all right or good, but they will be doing the same thing and going in the similar direction, but not be the specific motion. So, and then the opposition will argue that, oh, this solution the government is proposing, it's non-unique, it has alternatives, we don't understand why we should do this specific.
Okay. Now I got it. Okay, so if the opposition tries to challenge the government for saying that there are alternatives, so it really depends. The thing is this: A, it is not enough to prove that the motion has alternatives without proving that these alternatives are preferable, because, okay, there are alternatives, but if we agree that there is a problem and that my motion also solves it, it's not an argument against it. It just says there are also other ways. So unless it shows that the motion does an active harm, or alternatively, that the motion is mutually exclusive with the alternatives and the alternatives are preferable, it won't do much. And I do think that a common mistake is people just giving a list of one-liner alternatives without explaining at all why they are better, why they will work in solving the problem, why they are mutually exclusive. However, if they do these things, if they show that there is an alternative which is preferable, and that it is mutually exclusive with the motion, then yeah, it is an important challenge.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any more questions before I go to the next slide? Okay, so final notes on policy motions before we do some more practice and also talk about other types of motions. Firstly, the burdens are all independent of each other. So similar to how I flagged earlier that utility is not the same as solving the problem and that they can exist together or not exist together, it's true for each separate burden. A motion can be justified without solving the problem. A motion can solve the problem without being utile, and so on and so forth. So each burden is independent and not contingent on each other. Secondly, burdens help you both finding arguments in the first place. So a question I often get is, how do you come up with arguments in prep and with extensions? One good way to do this is to use the burdens of proof for a motion and to ask myself, what is the problem/problems in the debate? How can I prove that it solves it? How can I prove that it's justified? All of these will help me come up with arguments, but it's also, and not less importantly, helps me prioritize between arguments. So similar to what we said about burdens of proof in an argument, also in a motion, burdens are not created equal. Some of them will be more important than others. So as an example, and the classic one, in the motion This House would ban cigarettes, probably proving the problem isn't going to be the biggest issue here. It is unlikely anyone would argue that cigarettes smoking are not problematic for people or harmful in any way. It is likelier that people will challenge the justification. Similar to what we did earlier when I discussed RTM continuously disrupting my lecture, I probably don't need to prove each separately, like both the problem, the solution, the effectiveness, the justification, etc. But depending on what the debate is and what opposition is likely to challenge, I would prioritize what is most likely to be attacked. Thirdly, bite your bullet. And by this I mean, there are going to be arguments for opposition as well. You can't win them all. So the way to go at it isn't to try and show that there are no harms or that there are no problems that opposition can show or that the motion is 100% effective, but rather just weigh. Show that the arguments you give are better or more important than the opposing arguments. It is usually not worthwhile to try and challenge everything and disprove everything opposition says. And if we're talking about opposition, do note all of the 5 burdens we've listed are applicable to opposition as well, but in reverse. What do I mean by that? So while government supports the motion and opposes the status quo, opposition does the opposite. Opposition opposes the motion and supports the status quo. So when we are talking about problem from the perspective of opposition, rather than identifying a problem in the status quo to solve, opposition will try and identify a problem in the motion, in the world that will happen after the motion. Opposition will try to prove that the status quo solves it, that in the status quo the problem doesn't exist. Opposition will try to prove that the status quo is justified, and it's not trivial, by the way. Do note that government definitely has arguments that can show that the status quo isn't justified. In the motion This House would legalize marijuana, I from government would definitely argue that it is unjust that the government bans people from doing whatever they want with their body and liberty. And then opposition would need to prove that the status quo of banning it is justified, proving that that the motion does more harm than good. And granted, alternatives are less applicable to opposition. The main thing that opposition want to engage in terms of alternatives when it does happen is to show that the harms that the motion creates can't be mechanistically solved. So the alternative arguments from government side would be to say, oh, but opposition's arguments can be solved in just mechanistic ways, in other ways to add to the motion. The motion doesn't inherently create them. So importantly, remember that the burdens are symmetric. Lastly, because these burdens exist on both sides can and should try and flip the burdens to the other side, frame their arguments in a way that shows the other side has a burden. So the classic example is when I'm government and I want to talk about a justification clash, I will not say the motion is justified because this is mitigatory. This is not proving that we should accept it. This is just showing that it is not terrible. I would show the motion is a moral obligation. Opposition has the burden to prove that it is just. So if I has a burden to say ban something, like this house would ban cigarettes, I would not show it is justified to do so. I would show the cigarettes industry abuses people's health and freedom by getting them addicted to doing an activity that they don't choose to continue doing out of their own free will. Opposition needs to justify letting them continue this abuse and exploitation. We are doing our moral obligation to protect consumers. Other questions so far? I'll take it as a no. Let's do some more practice and then we'll move on to analysis motions. So first, in this house would ban sex bots. I want you all to take a minute, think of the problem, solution, justification, utility, and alternatives burdens. Think which ones are likely to be challenged and which ones aren't likely to be challenged. And then tell me what would be the burdens you would focus on as prop in this motion. Okay, let's try and start dissecting it together. Let's start with the problem. Can anyone tell me what is the problem that the motion is aiming to solve?
Maybe that people don't interact with each other on the, I don't know, sex part. But I think this is here I have a problem to prove that this is a problem, actually, yeah.
I think there's probably a bigger problem you can argue. I agree that this is a benefit of the motion, that it encourages more interactions. I think there's a bigger harm you can probably find here.
So maybe that those sex bots promote like bad attitudes and behavior towards women, specifically in real life?
Yeah. As a general note, for nearly any motion about banning sexual activity of any sort, this is applicable to sex bots, this is applicable to porn as well. To some extent, it is also applicable to prostitution, though I think there is a bigger problem to identify. We can always argue that these things promote a certain perception of how sex looks like. And here as government, I would probably want to say, people who are used to doing sex with a bot that never tells them no, that don't have their own wishes and desires, that does everything they want to, that never feels pain, will teach them bad sexual habits. They will teach them to not respect consent, to not seek for it, and to always feel like they are entitled to get anything they want. So this is probably a problem I can spot here. Question: who here thinks that we have a burden to prove that the motion solves the problem?
I mean, the op can argue that if you have tendencies towards those ideas, that you will like get them anyway, and it's not the the bot is not the reason, but is the actually the result.
I agree. I think actually a common mistake I notice in this motion, people think that the solution usually isn't a big burden here because, well, obviously if we ban them, we have less use of sex bots. Like the argument there's going to be a black market of sex bots is a very weird argument. I don't advise running this from op. However, proving that the problem of sexual violence is solved once you just remove the vessel that it is used for now is a very hard burden to prove. And I think there are two separate things that opposition might challenge here that we need to engage. Firstly is what Artyom said. We need to prove that people are not born as sexual predators, at least most of them, that it is taught, that this is a habit you acquire through your interactions, and that with the absence of the sex bots, they are likely to have positive sexual interactions with real human beings that will teach them the better habits. A second thing that the opposition might challenge is say, what's so unique about sex bots? Like, you still have porn, you still have like media and advertisements and anything else objectifying women. What's so special about robots? So here as well, we will want to analyze why specifically the sex bots are the ones that create this interaction that teaches a bad treatment of other humans, and why it is solved once you have good positive interactions with human beings, flesh and blood. I think, by the way, a possible good way to do this would be to talk about why it is likely that sex bots will be for many people their first or among their first interactions with the other sex, because it is possibly easier often for people who are inexperienced to get there, meaning that on the counterfactual, it is extremely likely people will seek interactions with humans because people will still have sexual desires, but they will now need to pursue them not with a robot, but with an actual human being, and then they will learn all of the positive interactions. But solution is definitely a burden here. Do we need to prove that the motion is justified?
I guess yes.
Why yes?
Because by banning something, as usual, we're like banning some laws, not banning. We're harming some not laws, some rights of people, and we should like, yeah, like
Okay.
we should.
So this is a confusing question. So it is true that as a general rule, if we are banning something, usually there is a burden of justification. I will say while this burden exists to some extent here, it is possibly the smallest burden. And the reason is, I want to see the opposition that is going to weigh and win on the argument that people have a fundamental basic right to a sex robot. Specifically when we are talking about something that is A, very much a privilege and not a necessity in any way, and B, not something that violates autonomy, but just a certain product, and C, lastly, something that is easily replaceable, or the funny but true rebuttal, okay, if they really, really want sex, they can still jerk off. I don't know why they need specifically a robot. It becomes an argument which is extremely hard to weigh in the debate. So I would say that while it is a burden, it would probably not be the one that I would focus on most. Especially when here, utilitarianism in particular is extremely easy to weigh above justification. Even if they prove some right is harmed, if they will need to weigh it up compared to us preventing sexual violence, they are probably going to lose. Lastly, fourthly, do we need to prove that the motion is utile?
I mean, if the problem that we are solving is as large, then the utility can be just another line of reasoning, and then we say that it is utile, whatever are the cons on the other side.
So the answer is yes and no. So as a piece of advice, if you want to ask yourself, is utility a burden? By the way, the answer is usually yes. Utility is the most common burden, not always a burden, but the most common one. But the best way to answer this is to try and figure out what is opposition going to argue. So we know if we need to compare against it. And I think probably in this motion, the biggest argument for opposition is going to be, but wait, we actually prefer people who have violent sexual tendencies to use a bot to do them rather than interact with an actual human being. We prefer that people will go to sex bots rather than to a prostitute or to an actual woman to express their violent desires. So it is true that our argument is directly clashing because we also want to prove that we prevent sexual violence, but we want to note that these are not necessarily the same people. It can very much be the case that some people are born good people and learn violence through sex bots, while other people are bad in nature and just use sex bots to vent their violence rather than innocent human beings. Meaning that we still probably want to weigh between them. Why it's likely that more people are the group we are preventing from being violent than the group that we are encouraging to be violent. Lastly, do you think that we need to prove that this solution is better than the alternatives?
Yes.
What alternatives do you think opposition might argue?
We can regulate sex bots, don't allow them to use violent practices and so on.
So I think it is a possible challenge. I will say it wouldn't be something I would do preemptively from PM. If leader of opposition wants to challenge and say regulation, they can go for it. The reason why I think it is unlikely in this particular motion alternatives will end up being a clash is because it is not in the interest of opposition to offer them. So while in many debates offering an alternative manages to mitigate government, in this debate, any alternative that opposition can offer will mitigate opposition as well. So if indeed they are going to argue, just regulate the sex bots to not accept violence, they are also losing a lot of their own benefits because they want to show that being able to be violent with them makes people not be violent with actual human beings because they can vent their violence on an object. So I will say in this particular case, it is unlikely for this one to be challenged. So always ask yourself on burdens, not only can they be challenged, but is it in the incentive of opposition to actually challenge them? Okay. Let's do one more example of the next ones, because I do think we need to have time also for the next motion types. Let's talk about the fourth one. I think it's the most difficult. This house would ban internet anonymity. Or in other wordings of this motion, this house would oblige people on the internet to identify using their real name. What do you think is the problem government is aiming to solve?
Anonymous violent chances, some radical ideas, and so on, bullying.
So
do you think it's a burden?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, people doing bad things on the internet.
Do you think it's a burden to prove that it's problematic? Will opposition argue that it isn't?
Seems like that.
Seems like what, sorry?
Seems like it's obvious that there are some minuses of anonymity.
It's unlikely opposition will say, nah, people never do bad stuff on the internet. People are great. We've never heard of cyberbullying. It's not a thing. Okay, solution. Is this something opposition might challenge here?
I think that we should prove that this solves the problem.
I think opposition has something similar to a black market argument, which is a bit tricky here. And that is to say, the real criminals, the actual assholes, will be able to maintain anonymity even when it is illegal. They will be able to go past the proxy, they will be able to log in from a different computer, and so on. It's very similar to what people often argue in the guns rights debates. This house would ban the use of guns in the United States, and then the classic opposition would be criminals will continue owning guns. They don't care about the law. It's only the good people that use them for self-defense that actually respect the law. So similarly here, probably opposition will go to something of those lines. Then, do we need to prove that the motion is justified?
Yes, probably.
What is going to be the justification challenge from opposition?
Well, they might say that anonymity is the right of a person because there are such times when the person doesn't want to commit something, any crimes, but just want to be anonymous on the internet and watch whatever he wants to watch and read the books and so on. For example, when his parents don't allow him to do this, and he wants to be anonymous so that his parents won't see him doing this. And if we ban his anonymity, it means that we harm his freedom.
In other words, probably opposition is going to argue something on the grounds of the right to privacy that is being violated here. It is worthwhile noting, similar to, like in most bedrooms, if we want to understand whether or not we need to prove them and how we need to prove them, we want to also identify what it is likely that specifically opposition will argue. And I think here to just think, what are the benefits of anonymity that opposition will argue for? What is the right that people are using it for? Will help us identify what it is exactly that we need to justify. So if I were opposition in this debate, I would probably talk less about the kid that wants to read stuff without their parents knowing, but possibly more about the kid who is gay and want to talk about people from his community without his conservative parents knowing about it. Or maybe the girl that is pregnant and want to Google where is the nearest abortion clinic to our house without her parents finding out. Or maybe it is people in authoritarian regimes that want to publish posts about their criticism towards the government, but don't want to be found out. Many different ways that opposition can take here. All of them are on the grounds of the right to privacy. Do we need to prove that the motion is utile?
Sorry, but is this a topic really about parents who can control their children? There are still, I don't know, mechanisms like parent control on the computers. They can do it.
A rebuttal that government can give to show that it is symmetric. I definitely think that parents are part of the debate, not the only ones. I would also talk about your conservative community, your authoritarian government, etc. But I do think that opposition will try and argue that in the status quo, parents maybe try to control their kids, but their kids at least have a way to, I don't know, go to a computer in their local Starbucks or library and log in from there and go incognito and search what they are looking for. Tomorrow they won't be able to.
But means ban of internet anonymity that even parents will know this information, like what Google their children.
Yeah. Banning internet anonymity means that literally anything you write on the internet is going to have your name next to it.
Even search?
I think it's not about what you search in the Google, but if you want to ask some questions in the anonymous public in the VK, or if you want to publish something extraordinary that will have some questions, you might have them, and your parents, which know your account, they can see this post and ask you what is it and ban you from doing this.
Everything that you will post will leave your name behind it. You will not be able to use a fake name for anything. That's basically the motion. Okay, do you think that we need to prove that the motion is utile, that it does more good than harm?
Yes, we'll have to weigh the bad things that people do on the internet with the good things that people can't do on the internet anymore.
Yeah, probably we'll need to characterize what is the most common thing people do while they are anonymous. Why it's likely that the good things are less likely to be the things that you want to hide, and the bad things are more likely to be the things that you want to hide. And lastly, do we need to prove that this motion is the best solution and there are no alternatives?
Yes.
What are going to be the alternatives that opposition might suggest?
I don't know, moderation, automatic filters, AI doing this work. I don't know anything.
Yeah, definitely this is probably in this particular debate, opposition is going to argue for many different alternatives, and we will need to prove why this motion is specifically the one to solve them. It's not extremely hard. We can show that it is impossible to monitor everything people say without significantly harming free speech, and you never know if someone writes a swear word intending to hurt someone or they are writing it in order to express genuine criticism. But it is probably a burden that we still need to prove. All right. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Yeah. Can I actually ask a question? So you said that we would be discussing the burdens of the motion. But here, for instance, in the last example, it's still very similar to the burdens of individual arguments, because, for instance, you say, is there a problem? There is a problem, and this is basically the largest argument the government can have. There are other arguments that government will have that will have a different problem, whether it solves it, and so on.
So I do think each of these burdens will have a separate argument to fulfill it. I will start by analyzing that, okay, problem and solution in particular are usually going to be combined into one argument, also not always, but often. So I'm going to start by, here's why there is a problem of abuse in the internet today. Here's why tomorrow we are solving this problem. A separate argument completely will be about the justification, which will probably be based on freedom of speech does not mean freedom of criticism, and the fact that in order to be able to express your thoughts on the internet, you should be accountable to what you say. And possibly then I will give added arguments on extra benefits that are independent of the problem. So things such as banning internet anonymity will probably also lead to just more people being exposed for their actual identities. So maybe the fact that today most people who are writing with their true names are probably white men, and people who are writing anonymously are the people who are more fearful of criticism, which are more likely to be minorities. Tomorrow we are going to be more exposed to their actual perspective. There are other different arguments you can argue here that are just going to be the smaller benefits. But I just think that this motion in particular is possibly more about depth than it is about width. That is, most of the extensions here are going to be vertical as opposed to horizontal. In other motions, I think it is clearer that there are multiple different arguments you can go with. So if we're talking as an example on, let's say the motion I have as in the second line here, this house would determine the verdict in criminal cases using a jury rather than a judge. Probably the problem that I'm going to identify will be that a judge is not representative enough of the people, that juries are more reflective of minorities in society, etc. And this will be the problem and solution. But in the utility clash, I can add a bunch of other benefits. Like, one would be that it just gets the citizens more involved in the legal process. It makes people more educated about their legal system. Another benefit that it can create is how it leads to the incentive of criminals to behave in courts in the ways that make them more appealing to juries, which is less likely to create bad, violent rhetoric by advocates, which often do things such as victim blaming, etc., which can work in court in front of a judge, but are not very convincing to a jury, and so on. But any of these will not be the main problem I will flag, but just added arguments that I can have. And to be clear, all the arguments that we've listed still need to be dissected into their own burdens of proof. So as an example, proving that people have a right to privacy, say, an opposition in the motion about the internet, or alternatively, from proposition, proving that people's right to expressing their opinions is contingent on their ability to be held accountable and criticized, are things that we need to dissect into burdens. It will start by A, why do people have a freedom of speech in the first place? B, why does it mean that if they are not criticized, we are losing this purpose? C, why they are not criticized when they are anonymous and therefore we are losing this benefit, and then connecting it to the motion. So each of the things we said still need to be dissected into burdens. Or in the motion about sex bots, as an example, the argument that sex bots encourage sexual violence also needs to be dissected into its smaller burdens of proof. So it would be that A, sexual violence is something that is learned. B, that the ways that it is learned are expressed during the use of sex bots, that it creates the learning of sexual violence. C, that it wouldn't have happened alternatively, that you wouldn't learn the same behaviors from other activities, such as maybe watching porn. And D, that the motion indeed solves it. So all of these things are still going to be needed to be dissected into smaller burdens. Does this answer the question?
Yeah, I see. I was just wondering that, like, those burdens that we have been discussing here are still mostly connected to the argument, and I was wondering whether, like, I assume that there are some burdens that are universal for most arguments in one debate. So, for instance, justification would be similar, like this. For instance, like, there are a lot of benefits of banning cigarettes, but the burden to prove that you have a right to do that is one for all of them, right?
So yeah, but I don't think that every motion has a justification clash. I think in some of them it's unlikely to be contested. If I'm to give an example of this, I think classically, actually, the first example, this House would ban sex bots, is where it is extremely unlikely that opposition will try to die on the hill of people's basic right to use a sex bot. So I think there are sufficient motions in which justification isn't a very important burden as well. The framework to think of it in general is, I think Milos discussed it in one of our earlier sessions. Think of a tree with branches that go into smaller branches. So the roots of the tree always begin with the motion. What do we want to prove to win the motion? The burdens of the motion are its branches, and then each branch goes into smaller branches, which are the burdens of proof for each argument.
Yeah, thank you. This makes sense, although you might be surprised to discover Russia to be one of the places where people might be willing to die on that hill.
Okay, we'll discuss it another time then. Not usually what you want to argue in this debate. Okay, analysis debates. Slightly more complicated, and there's a reason why I placed them after policy debates, despite the fact that today they are not less common, I think. So, while there are similarities, some burdens just don't exist in analysis motions, and some burdens act quite differently. So firstly, in analysis debates, we will almost never have an efficacy burden. That is, proposition has the fiat to assume the motion just happens. To give an example of what I mean, in the motion, this House prefers a world without drugs, opposition cannot argue, but you can never get rid of drugs, there will be a black market. It's not this House would ban drugs. We have the fiat to assume as government that the world that we are imagining in this debate is a world without drugs at all, and nothing can change that. So efficacy is usually not a burden in analysis debates. Principles, or the question of justification, does remain, but in a different manner. What do I mean by that? Since we are not talking about a policy, there isn't a government action that needs to be justified. We are not forcing anything. So if we take again the example of this house prefers a world without drugs, we don't need to justify the government taking away the rights of people to consume drugs. They just don't exist. No one does any action. However, principal questions can remain, just not in the form of justifying an action from the government, but rather from a moral question of, is the world we are imagining just more or less moral? Do we think it is morally right that the world will be this way? So to give an example, in the motion this House believes that Britain should pay reparations to the former British colonies, it is not the same as this House would require Britain to pay reparations. We do not need to justify intervening in British sovereignty and forcing them to do this. We do need to justify Britain taking away money from British citizens and giving it to post-colonial state citizens. We can still argue from opposition that the motion is unjust, not because it is unjust to do so, because no one does it, but that the world that government supports is an unjust world, a world in which an unfair action happens. So, efficacy usually not a burden. Principles stay but change their form. Often, we will have an added burden of characterization. That is, we do not have a fiat to define a model in analysis motions the same way that we have in policy debates when we are defining them. So as an example, in the motion this House supports the practice of shaming, like online shaming, Me Too, etc., government cannot say, we exclusively support shaming that is only against people who are proven guilty. We do not support shaming of people who are innocent. We will define it as only shaming the worst kind of people, etc. Proposition does not have the fiat to model how shaming looks like. Rather, they have the burden to define or analyze how it's likely to look like. They can say it is extremely unlikely for someone to shame publicly someone who is innocent because they know that probably the innocent person has an alibi and they don't want to get caught shaming an innocent person because it will only harm them, as an example. The point is that we have very often the added burden of characterizing what we think the motion is likely to look like. And similar to no model fiat, there is also no counterprop fiat. So the burdens of alternatives is somewhat smaller. So as an example, in the motion, this House supports queerbaiting. For anyone who doesn't know, queerbaiting is the phenomenon in which TV shows and movies present characters which have presumably queer traits, but are never actually out of the closet. Many people have blamed Frozen for this, for Elsa being allegedly gay, but never talking about it. Opposition cannot say, as a counterprop, we don't think that movies should have queerbaiting. We think that movies should actually represent out and proud queer people that actually identify as gay and don't just bait it. Because government will say, okay, so do we, but we just don't think it is likely to happen because TV shows don't want to lose their conservative audience, so it's either queerbaiting or nothing. Opposition can, however, prove that it is likely to be the counterfactual, that without queerbaiting, TV shows would try to cater to queer audiences by actually putting out and proud queer people in their shows. So alternatives do exist. They can be proven, but they can't be counterpropped by fiat, so they are usually a smaller burden in analysis motions. With all of these caveats about the burdens that change, the structure of burdens aside from that remains roughly the same to policy debates. What do I mean by that? There are 4 common wordings of analysis motions. So I'll just go quickly through them and show to you how they are equivalent to policy debates in their burdens in this case. So in the motion, this house prefers a world where X happens, like this house prefers a world without drugs, this house prefers a world without the narrative that people should be modest or whatever. It is the equivalent of this house would implement X, this house would ban drugs as the equivalence here. But the thing that changes are the things that we've mentioned before. So the problem solution burdens don't change. We still want to prove that the drugs are a problem. Solution does change, sorry. Solution is usually not a burden because we don't need to prove that it is effective. So we won't need to prove that the motion effectively bans them because they just disappear. In this case, we won't need to prove a justification. We will need to prove that it is utile. We will need to prove that alternatives that opposition can argue, such as regulations of drugs in the status quo, don't solve the problem, and we just need a world without them altogether. In the motion, this house supports X. It is similar to this house would do X. So like in the motion, this house supports shaming, or the practice of shaming. It is similar to this house would shame or would promote shaming, etc. In these cases, however, aside from, again, less focus on efficacy and justification from the state, we do have, however, the justification question of is shaming justified in the world existing. What is important to note in support motions is rather than identifying the problem in the status quo, it is flipped. We are trying to analyze what is the likely counterfactual and identify the problem there. So in the motion, this house supports shaming. We would try to identify, in a world without shaming, what is the problem? How does shaming solve the problem? Why is it justified to solve the problem through shaming, and so on? This house opposes would be the exact opposite of this house supports, so we will try and identify a problem in the status quo and a solution in the counterfactual. And in this house believes that X should do Y. This is a classic example of what we call policy in a disguise of analysis. It is almost identical to the motion this house would do Y. So this house believes that the US should invade Syria is almost the same as this house would invade Syria. The only difference is the actor implementing the motion is a specific state. So we have the fiat of this state, meaning that if, from a perspective of some countries, invading Syria would be very, very weird, from the perspective of the US, we can say that they have the military capacity to do so. What definitely doesn't change, and what makes this motion still very similar to the policy equivalent of it, is the perspective. It is not this house as the US. We still care about the global perspective, what is better for the world. Just showing that it is bad for the US to do this is not yet debate winning. So this house believes that X should do Y is almost the same as policy. Let's do a quick example together. In the motion, this house opposes the Pride Parade. It's a simple one. Let's start identifying the burdens. Firstly, what is the problem in the status quo that we're going to try and find as a government? Anyone has any ideas?
Well, that the Pride parades alienate a lot of people and are used as arguments by the conservatives and so on.
Yep. What do we need to prove in solution? Do you think solution is a burden here?
Not in the sense that we need to prove that Pride parades cease to exist, but in the sense that that the Pride parades are the reason for conservatives hating the LGBTQ community.
Yeah. So we don't have a burden of efficacy in terms of proving that we will eliminate Pride. We do have a burden to show that absent Pride, the backlash would stop. There wouldn't be other sources to create it. Do we need to prove justification? Any thoughts?
I mean, kind of, in a weird way, maybe, but generally.
Why would we need to prove justification? What is the principal harm that is done here?
Well, saying that maybe the community has the basic right to express themselves in whatever the way they wish, and that if there weren't those pride parades, that they would not be able to exercise the right.
So I think actually this is an example of emotion in which this is not a burden. And I think it's good to go through this example. It is true that the community probably has a right to express themselves, which would be an argument against banning pride. This motion doesn't say that the government bans it, that if anyone wants to go out to the street and put up a sign, anyone would stop them. We assume that it just happens, that maybe the community decides to stop doing it for whatever reason. Maybe that they decide that it is bad for them. In any case, we don't need to prove that it is just to take away people's rights to a parade, because we are not taking away their right. We just prefer it not to happen. So in this case, justification won't be a burden. Is it clear why?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we need to prove utility?
Yes.
Probably yes. It's going to be probably yes in almost any motion. And do we need to prove that this is the best solution out of all alternatives?
No, I don't think we should look at the alternatives because we oppose this exact solution.
Yeah, opposition is not going to be able to say, no, just make pride differently because they don't have this fiat. And it is unlikely that they would try to analyze that pride is likely to be differently because we all know pride in the status quo. They are not going to be able to analyze that it is in fact not something that pisses off conservatives or that it is likely to change in a way that won't piss off conservatives, because it is something that is probably going to be agreed to be somewhat inherent to pride. All right. Are there any questions on burdens in analysis motions? These are the most complicated ones, I think, out of all motion types. So if you want to take time to ask questions on these ones, it's probably worthwhile. Okay, in which case, regret motions. So regret motions have two steps of branches. I'm going to branch them first to two very big burdens, and then one of these burdens will be branched out to smaller ones. So the two very big burdens of regret motions is one, what is the likely counterfactual to what we are regretting? What would have happened if the thing that we are regretting wouldn't have happened? And the second one is the counterfactual better or worse than the status quo, depending on whether you're opposition or proposition? Now, in terms of smaller branches, in essence, regret motions are like retroactive oppose motions. So this house opposes is very similar to this house regrets, just retroactively. It's like this house opposes X has happened rather than X existing in the status quo. Similar to oppose motions, which we discussed in analysis, we will identify a problem in the status quo and a solution in the counterfactual. The only difference is both the status quo and counterfactual will spread across history. What do I mean by that? So in the smaller branches, when we ask ourselves on the second question, is the counterfactual better or worse than the status quo? We will use the same burdens of proof as we would for analysis debates. When we start from a problem, so if we are government, the thing that has happened has led to a problem in the status quo that we want to identify. Solution will be based on the counterfactual. We would want to argue if this thing hadn't happened, then on the counterfactual, we wouldn't have had this problem. And then justification is not going to be very much a clash here like it is not in most analysis debates. Utility will stay, and so on. Important note on the retroactive aspect of problems. Problems can also be ones of the past. It is a common mistake I notice in regret motions that people think that if they just say, oh, but it used to be a problem, but today it's not a problem any longer, it solves anything. When effectively, when we are regretting something, we are also regretting its past results. As an example, in the motion, this house regrets religion, it is super valid to argue that even if today religion is inclusive and liberal and moderate, in the past, it was responsible to millions of deaths and suffering of individuals, and we regret that. Even if today it's fine, we would have rather had a world in which all of this suffering wouldn't have existed in the first place, rather than lived through thousands of years of oppression only to solve them in the 21st century. Is that concept clear to everyone?
Yep.
Yes.
Awesome. Just like in analysis motions, in regret motions as well, no one has a fiat to either model or counterprop, but rather everyone has the burden to analyze what the counterfactual is likely to look like. A common mistake I notice people do in regret motions is Prime Minister saying something like, we regret that this happened, we propose instead that this would have happened. This is not something that Prime Minister is allowed to do. You don't get to define what would be the alternative history line. You need to analyze what would have likely happened if the motion hadn't happened. Similarly, opposition cannot argue, we propose that instead of regretting this, let's regret that. This is one of my favorite rebuttals that I see often that people don't realize are very not legitimate rebuttals, but it's something like, I think I recall as an example, in the motion, this house regrets Me Too. Opposition said that all of our problems on government with Me Too movement aren't inherent to Me Too, but are just small part of it, like false accusations. And an opposition, they do not regret Me Too, they just regret the bad aspects of it. So I think my response to them from government was, okay, and I regret the Holocaust. What does that have anything to do with the motion? You do not get to choose and cherry pick what you regret and what you do not regret in the history. It happened as a direct result of Me Too. You need to regret that as well. You do not get to counterprop regretting something else. And if you get to, I always counterprop regretting the Holocaust because it's easy to regret. Also, the status quo, unlike the counterfactual, doesn't need to be proven. You can use historical facts that are known in hindsight as a given. You don't need to prove that it is likely that Me Too has led to a specific impact that we know it has led to. If we know effectively something happened in history, we can take it as a given fact. Opposition can argue it would have happened regardless due to other reasons, but we don't need to prove that it would likely happen if it did. Let's do a small practice. This house regrets the fall of the Soviet Union. Let's say that we are proposition. Let's start by identifying the problem. And I flag back, in regret motions, the problem is in the status quo and the solution is in the counterfactual. What do you think, as government, you would argue is a problem in the status quo that is a result of the fall of the Soviet Union?
I don't know, democracy in Eastern Europe. Joking.
Okay. It's a hard motion. I'm not claiming it's a balanced one, by the way, but it is a good practice. What would be a problem you identify in the status quo that happened due to the fall of the Soviet Union?
Well, all the economic hardship in the 90s and the failed state-like situations in many countries of the former Soviet Union.
Yeah. I would probably argue that the fall of the Soviet Union has led to massive corruption and inequalities due to early privatization of many pieces of land and resources, which has led to oligarchy, which has led to many corrupt leaders trying to please the oligarchs, as well as massive inequality and massive poverty in many post-Soviet states. How would you try and argue that on the counterfactual, this wouldn't have been a problem? What would you want to argue that probably would have happened in the counterfactual?
Like Soviet Union reforming like China did, or someone else, something else did.
That's the important note. A very common mistake I see people do in motions such as that is only discuss what happened before the motion and not what would have happened if the motion wasn't to occur. And this is the real issue of the counterfactual. It is easy for opposition to say, but we all know that the Soviet Union was pretty shit in many things. The way to go about it from proposition is usually not to defend Stalin or not even the later leaders, which were probably more moderate, but say, I mean, China was also much, much worse before the 90s, and they've had their great leap forward since. Given many other changes that happened during the 90s, like the internet, like globalization, etc., it's extremely likely that even if the Soviet Union would have stayed, in many ways it would be much more liberal today. And this would probably be part of the explanation both to solving the problem and as well to proving utility. Is that point clear to everyone? Because this was the biggest reason why I used this example to show to you what we are looking for in analyzing the counterfactual. It's not just about what happened, but what would have happened that we want to analyze. Are there any questions on regret motions?
Yeah, about this particular topic about Soviet Union. So, is it possible to rebuttal this argument of opposition that, government actually, that it was the way for Soviet Union to become somehow democratic state, that this process can be better in case of Soviet Union not falling down. So it will be a way to democracy, somehow democratic reforms and so on. And now we have situation that in one moment we had democratic Russia, not with a full freedom, but still like with freedom that we cannot, that we don't have now. So I mean that argument that this direction of liberalizing, I don't know how to say, is much better than a situation when we got democratic state, and then we have way back, like with some authoritarian reforms and so on. If you understand what I mean.
So the question is how we would weigh against opposition arguing that today is more liberal, or how we would argue against proposition argument that the Soviet Union would have become more liberal than the status quo.
I mean that the situation when we have still have a Soviet Union and much more democratic state, Soviet Union, is better. This way is better than we have now Russia, which is quite authoritarian, and we had this period like democratic period, but still it goes to authoritarian state. So,
Okay.
and it will be better to still have Soviet Union with these democratic reforms. And one of the argument can be that so this direction is better for society, like to feel that it goes right way.
So I think I would definitely argue from proposition that in the status quo, Russia is also not exactly a democracy. I don't know if I would go as far as trying to claim that the Soviet Union continuing would have been more democratic, because while I think it is relatively accessible to prove that it would have been more liberal than it used to be before the 90s, I think it's hard to prove that it would be liberal, given that one thing that is inherent to the Soviet Union is at least some degree of communism, which does require quite a lot of government control. I would, however, from proposition, try to weigh why it is less important. So as an example, when we have on both counterfactuals a relatively corrupt and not fully democratic state, at least under the Soviet Union, similar to what happens today with the CCP in China, they are accountable to people's equality and getting an income, because the only thing that grants the legitimacy to the government being undemocratic is giving the people their basic rights and needs for sustaining themselves. Today, we get corruption without this accountability to the people, because people feel an illusion of democracy, and you don't need to please them by giving them food and shelter and clothes, etc. Does that answer the question?
Okay, yeah, thank you.
All right. Lastly, and I think the easiest ones, are actor motions. So similar to regret motions here, they will be firstly in two big branches, which will branch into smaller branches. I will say from the get-go, unlike regret motions, they are very similar not to analysis motions, but to policy motions. We'll go through this soon. The basic structure, or the two biggest branches of actor motions, are the two following questions. A, what are the interests of the actor? And two, where are those interests best fulfilled? The second question is the one that will be branched into smaller burdens. So how do we prove where are the interests of the actor best fulfilled? The answer is just the same as we would do in policy. We would identify a problem for the actor in the status quo. We would prove that the motion, if the actor does it, solves the problem of the actor. We would prove, and I'll get to this soon, also that it is justified. A common mistake is to think that we don't care about justification in actor motions. I will soon explain why we do. We will show why it will do more benefits than harms to the actor, and also why it's the best alternative, why the actor cannot do other things in order to solve the actor's problem. What does change between actor motions and between policy motions? Only two things, and the structure of burdens other than that will remain the same. Firstly, everything is from the perspective of the actor, meaning that when we ask ourselves questions such as utility, we don't ask ourselves what is better for the world, what does more good than harm in reality, but does it do more good than harm to the actor? The actor is the only one we care about in these motions. Secondly, the fiat is also limited to the fiat of the actor. So while we do have model fiat, we can explain how we will do something. We cannot use the power of the state to do that. I'll give you an example I've had in a real debate once. In the motion, this house as a vegan would actively and aggressively try and push their friends to convert to veganism. I have once seen an OG trying to define this as, we will put ads on meat products that show the suffering of animals in graphic details. We will put taxations on meat products, etc. It was an obvious theme. The point to remember here is, you can't do that. You are not the state. You don't get all of this fiat. You do get the fiat to define what you will do as an individual. Are you going to talk a lot during meals? Are you going to send them videos of lectures about veganism? Are you going to tell them that it is immoral, or are you going to focus on this being unhealthy for them? many different ways you can define this, but only with the fiat of the actor that you have. Now, justification. Why is justification still a burden in actor motions? Because as I've said earlier, we only care about the interest of the actor. We don't care about what is the global good. A thing that I think is very easy for debaters to forget is maybe we are. Most actors in real life aren't exclusively selfish. Most people do have also moral incentives, also non-selfish incentives. So the easiest example for this would be in the motion, this house as a parent would plant a chip on their kid that follows them everywhere they go. There is a justification clash here. I need to show that it is legitimate of me as a parent to do this to my child because, yes, despite this being a perspective debate, parents care about their children. Parents do have moral values associated with not harming their kids. So moral arguments and justification clashes are definitely a burden. They just need to be linked to the moral values of the actor. But it is important to remember incentives of an actor are not only selfish ones, you also have moral incentives. Also, an actor doesn't have to be an individual. It is the most common form of actor motions, but an actor can also be a state, it can be a movement, it can be an organization, it can be any specific stakeholder that we want to take the perspective of. And one last thing to be said about this, actors have multiple incentives, not only the most obvious ones. So in the example I gave before on this house as a vegan, it is a common mistake that I see people only talking about what is more likely to make people convert to veganism, if we are being very aggressive about it or if we only mention it occasionally, which is fine, and it's definitely a clash in this debate, but vegans don't only care about animals. They have other incentives too. And my biggest CO argument in this debate is just, you're going to lose all of your friends. I don't care if it's good or worse, if it's better or worse for animals. You're going to stay alone, and it's not fun. Similarly, in the motion, this house as a feminist would reject acts of chivalry from men, like holding the door open or paying for dates, etc. The fact that the actor is a feminist tells us one of their incentives. Yeah, we care about promoting women's rights and acting against sexism. It doesn't mean that we don't care about other things too as this actor. Probably a feminist also still cares about going on dates and getting a partner, still cares about being popular, still cares about getting a job and not being perceived as too hard to work with. So don't get tricked by a motion specifying an actor that has an obvious incentive. It is an incentive to take into consideration, but they have other incentives too. Let's start with a practice. This house, as Iran, would resume its nuclear weapons program. Let's go with the structure of burdens. What would you identify as government in this debate as the problem that we are aiming to solve?
Well, the safety of the country or the regime, depending on how you frame it.
Yep, mostly the power balance. We are in the Middle East. We're surrounded by many foes and constant war. Probably we want to have balance compared to other countries with access to nukes, such as Saudi Arabia, Israel, whatever. We want to maintain our safety through deterrence and being able to defend ourselves. Solution. Do we need to prove that resuming the development of nuclear weapons would solve the problem?
Yes.
Why?
Because it is not clear that we are able to develop nuclear weapons.
Yep. Biggest challenge for MOP is probably going to be it will take many years to develop. In the meanwhile, countries will only be pissed at you and act against you before you are able to complete it. In which you would probably want to argue things such as we will hide it and won't tell the world, we'll do it in secretly. or we will use our existing reserves already and just continue on them. We don't have that much left to finish it. Different ways to go about it, but we probably want to prove that the problem is indeed solved. Do we need to prove that it is justified?
From the state perspective, from Iran perspective, yes.
Why so? What would opposition argue is unjustified?
Well, I mean, in a different meaning of justification. I don't think they care about the morals of it, but justify it as an utility, basically.
So don't conflate between the arguments. We are going to have an expert about utility, but showing that it is harmful for Iran, that is, that it is not worthwhile for us, does not show that it is unjustified. In this particular case, I don't think that there is a justification clash. To be clear, it's not that when we talk about authoritarian regimes, there is never a justification clash. In a different motion but about the same actor, say this house as Iran would stop funding organizations that do its proxy wars in the Middle East, I would say that there is a justification argument. I would talk about Iran having maybe a moral obligation to its organization that it funded due to the obligation to Shia Islam, given how they claim to be the moral, claim to be the global leaders of them, etc. But in this particular motion, given that we are not harming any group that we can easily prove Iran cares about, I wouldn't say that we have a justification burden. Do we need to prove that it is utile?
Yes.
Hell yes. There are going to be so many harms that
Yeah,
we need to drop here. And lastly, do we need to prove that this is the best of all alternatives that Iran has?
I think yes.
To some extent, yes. There is going to be probably different claims from opposition about how we can self-defend in other ways, like maybe conventional weapons, maybe the fact that there are global diplomatic measures to prevent countries from attacking us, etc. Are there any questions on actor motions? Okay, with this, the slides end. So, are there any questions about burdens of motions at all?
Not sure.
All right.
I think we have been asking questions all along when they popped up.
All right. In which case, I will see you all in the next session. And as always, do feel free to send questions through Artium if you have them retroactively. And yeah, see you all in 2 weeks.
Yep. See you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.